Hello, and welcome to the Success Showcase. I'm your host, Eric Lopkin from the Modern Observer Group. And with me, as always, is Chip Janiszewski from the Happiness and Success GPS. Chip, how you doing this week?
Doing great. How about you, Eric?
Doing fantastic.
Hard to believe we're winding down January already.
Yeah, by the time this airs, it will be the first week in February. And it is amazing how quickly time goes. It's
Oh, okay. We fooled everybody. They thought they were live recordings out there. We're really doing, I'm just kidding.
So today we are going to be talking about the power of storytelling. And for the most part, a lot of what we've been talking about lately has revolved around communications. And telling your story is a great way to make an impact. And it's not necessarily just your story or just in business. This is something that a lot of folks have been talking about over the past few years, but it goes back forever. There's a reason why there are Bible stories, why Greek and Roman and Egyptian myths occur. It's because telling a story is a much more impactful way to get a point across. Whether you're talking about a behavior, an event, the story has a power all its own. And we've actually had two examples here on this podcast over the last few years, one of which is Kate Mollison, who listeners will remember just moderated our grief talk. But for her, telling her story is a very powerful sales tool because she didn't just become a grief counselor, a grief coach, and bereavement expert because she studied it. She became that because she lived it. She became a widow at a very young age, and she became a grief coach to help people go through what she went through. And when she tells her story, it shows her expertise. And again, not because she read these things in a book, but because she lived it. Another example we've had on this podcast going back a few years was one of our guests, Teresa DeGray, who is a bankruptcy attorney. And when she meets with new clients, she tells them the story of how she had health problems and the medical bills got too much to handle, and she had to declare bankruptcy. So her clients understand that she knows this stuff firsthand. And in both of these cases, they're not just talking about theory. They're not just telling about what has to be done. They're telling about their experiences. They're making it personal. And that is part of the power of storytelling.
Yeah, absolutely. Basically, got a quote here said at its core, stories seek to establish connections with us, the audience. They incite emotions by putting us in the perspective of the characters. They establish familiarity with the person who's talking and allows us to immerse ourselves in the narrative. And we are all born children. And one of the first things that we do for children, even before they start talking and so on and so forth, we're picking up books and we're reading them stories. So that is embedded in us right from when we're growing up. And as we do grow up, the teachers that use stories to kind of get their point across as we move along, it's so much more powerful than just going in there and preaching and teaching to people, because it's so important to make that personal connection. And that's what a story is. Basically, it's an emotional connection with the audience. And it could be your own story, or it could be other stories that are told. I mean, you mentioned obviously that's used a whole lot in the Bible. That's what Jesus used parables for all over. And by telling the stories, he's able to explain what's going on rather than just saying this is the way it should be done or that's the way it should be done. And so when you're dealing with sales and so on and so forth, it's really, really important to establish that personal connection so that people know that you're authentic and not just out there for sales. I mean, authenticity is where stories come from, especially when you're talking about your own personal stories. So it's just a great way to connect, and it's a great way to engage an audience, because an audience would rather be engaged and hear about different things, because life itself is a story. I mean, you hear about them every single day. You see them on the news. You talk with your families about different things going on. I mean, even what happened in school today, it's a story. So
Exactly. And when you're giving a presentation or you're doing a sales pitch, people react to emotions. They tend not to react as much to data. So you can give all the facts and figures you want, but that's not going to build a connection. It could be very impressive, it could make a point, but you're not building that connection and you're not getting the same impact as when you tell a story. And I've done this in numerous presentations where I will talk about the power of mindset. And that is a big part of our coaching program. And I will talk about how it's used and what you can use it for. And then as I start to wrap up, as I get to the end, I do, what is my big reveal and how I've used mindset, not just to build my business, which is also a story in itself, but how I've used the mindset to affect my own health, to overcome being legally blind, to overcome being a diabetic. And mindset factored heavily into both of these things. And the story of using mindset to overcome adversity makes a much bigger impact than I could ever make quoting facts and figures, telling people about research. The research is great. The research backs everything up. It gives you the reason to say, oh, okay, yes, there's actual proof that this works. But the story gives it the impact. The story makes that connection. And again, especially if you're trying to teach something, Aesop's fables, the Socratic method of teaching that, developed by Socrates, are all based on stories, because the examples are so much more powerful than just saying, this is what you should do.
yeah, I mean, when I'm talking to people, I always love the phrase, example is not the main thing in influence, it is the only thing. And basically, I follow it up with, if you're talking to somebody and obviously you love people and so on and so forth, if you see something's wrong, it's human nature to want to correct it and point it out and so on and so forth. And I just tell people, people expect to be taught in school and preached to in church. Otherwise, when you approach them, it's the wrong way to do things. And obviously, there's what you're talking about as far as your own personal story is so important. And you and I are both like in the motivational field, and we're both teach people networking. And when we talk about networking, you talked about, different numbers and so on and so forth and what the goods are. And we both preach the most important thing about networking and about anything is relationships. So if you want to grow your business, the most important thing you can do, hopefully, number one, you're engaged in doing what you're doing, but share what your value added is, how you solve problems for people and so on and so forth, to get them engaged and realize that that's what you're trying to do, is to help them out. And that should be a major, major part of your commercial, not the sales pitch in there. And obviously, if you can tell a story about how you have done this for other people, if you're in the motivational side like you and I are, obviously your story is amazing. And I talk about, how I got my degree in accounting, went to work for my dad and so on and so forth. And I morphed into being the happiness and success GPS just because of my experiences over the years and because of the way that I've started my day really, really looking at motivational things myself and realizing that it's all about what's in your heart rather than what's in your head. And it's so important. And if I just walked in and talked to people about, hey, you should have a positive mindset. You realize positivity is a choice. Stop being so negative. What are people going to do? See you later, Chip. Bye. But if
Exactly. In fact, it's human nature when someone tells you to do something,
yeah,
your first reaction is, "Oh, I'm not going to do that."
yeah, even if that would have been your idea, if it comes from somebody else, as far as the direct thing, it's a direct affront upon you, and it's because we are all insecure. And if somebody touches on something that we think that we should be doing, or so on and so forth, and whatever, just because of our own securities, we all of a sudden put up that protective shield. And that's standoffish, negative reaction. How come you're doing this? It's conflict instead of collaboration. And basically, what we're all about, the C word should be just be compassion. And with that, obviously, the stories show a whole lot about that, about how you've done things and so on and so forth. And just by sharing what you have done, and I've seen you do that before and watch the audience when they do that, it's amazing because everybody has their problems and this and that, whatever. And seeing a live example in front of them, as far as somebody who not only has conquered that themselves, but is sharing this and sharing motivation with other people through everything you do, it's so powerful. Rather than just walking in and say, hey, you should buy my little manual and do your time management thing and fill out your charts for goals and all this other kind of stuff. Then if you have all these checklists, everything's going to be perfect.
Yeah, the story is so much more impactful. And we've talked a lot about why you should be telling stories, but telling stories doesn't come naturally to everyone. So we're going to go through some ways that you need to put your story together. And the first thing that you really need to do is figure out what your message is. Every story should have a clear central message or a moral. What is the point of the story? We've all listened to folks, friends, relatives who start telling stories, and you realize, 10 minutes in that there's no point to the story. They're just telling you what happened. If you're telling a story to make an impact, you need to have a central theme. There needs to be a point. Why are you telling the story? What is that moral? Every Bible story, Aesop's fable, they all have a single point. And that's something else that it's important to realize is that you're telling one story, it should have one point. If you're doing a major presentation where you have several points, you should be telling several stories. And not rapid succession either, because once you tell a story, you want to leave time for your audience to adjust to it, to absorb the message. But you should really limit your story to one message and make sure you have a message.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so important to really fine tune things. And obviously, we as the presenters and knowing everything, people tend to want to get everything out in one talk. And our retention span is what, 5%, if that, for
Something like that, yes.
within a half an hour after you walk out. So I mean, in the TED Talks thing, I mean, he fine tunes it. I think he thinks um, maybe three major points and having everything organized that way so that it's simple on the takeaways. And so and just sticking to that is so important rather than just rambling on and going all over the place. So it's really important to get organized ahead of time and have it written down, simplify it. And if there's a lot of different things, set it up as a series and do several different talks instead of doing it all at once because it's just not going to work that way. But being your authentic self and delivering it that way is so important. So
Absolutely. You need to be authentic when you're telling your story. It needs to come from you. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it's your story, but you shouldn't back away from telling your stories. There is something very powerful about sharing your story as opposed to just telling a story. telling a story is good. Telling your story is great because you're a living example of it. And it allows you to connect more with the audience. And again, that's part of the purpose of the story is that connection. So you want to make it personal and don't shy away from it. So many people will think, oh, I'm not going to tell my story. My story's boring. I do that very often. I will not mention something or I'll forget about something altogether, in fact, until somebody else brings up something that reminds me of it. And I'll think it's nothing. But when I start talking about it, the audience I'm talking to will go, wait a minute, you did what? So we're not necessarily the best judges of whether or not our story catches people's attention.
Yeah, and obviously, you and I both have experience on our sides too. So we've been through a few different things, and I mean, my story, as a lot of people know, is I got out of school, got my degree in accounting, worked for my dad for 20 years in manufacturing, and so on and so forth. And basically, I didn't start becoming who I am now until my mid 40s, and here I am. It took me 20, 25 years to develop into what I am, and basically, it was just different steps all the way working on my personal development side of things. And obviously, networking had a lot to do with it, learning the power of relationships and getting involved in a lot of other things. But talking about that on my journey to the happiness and success GPS, I mean, I kind of go through this in a very fun way. I always start with the journey from carefree child to paranoid adult, and then talk about the power of positivity and how you can handle things. And I like to filter in things like my baby picture in black and white, and my granddaughter's baby picture at the same age in color, both waving hands and so on and so forth. So those things are fun, but people hearing how I've grown up through the 60s and all this other kind of stuff and to where I am now and to why I'm doing what I'm doing. I mean, people know that you and I, when we talk, we're just emanating what we are and that we're there with our experiences to help other people out and realize that they can do the same thing too. And all it is just it's a choice in the moment to do that kind of thing. And obviously, what we're doing in this day of saturation from the media and the web and everything else, it's so important for people to hear our message that, hey, you got to take time out, work on that person in the mirror. And by the way, that person is awesome. And that's just a simple message. If I just walk in there and I say that during my commercial, I've done my purpose, and people are already walking out with a value added for the day just by hearing that. Even though they hear it over and over again at West Hartford Connections and so on and so forth, they know what to expect. Whereas if somebody walks in with the latest thing on mortgage rates or this or that or whatever every 2 weeks and so on and so forth, I'm reading down a list of different things that you do. That's great, but we know that too. But everybody's sitting there saying, "What's in it for me?" And one of the things you can do, "What's in it for me," is to entertain them a little bit and get them engaged. And storytelling is a great way to do that.
Yes, it is. And something else that you have to remember when you're putting together your story is you need to have conflict. There needs to be something that, if it's your story, that you've overcome. If you're telling a story about someone else, that they have overcome. And it can be a health issue, it can be a crisis. Um, I meditate very often. And one of the things that I started listening to when I started meditating was a guided meditation. And in the guided meditation, the person tells the story about someone she used to work with in the restaurant business. And he was always positive. He had a positive mindset. People flocked to him because of his positivity. And they tell the story about one day in the restaurant, he's closing up and he made a fatal mistake, or it could have been a fatal mistake. He forgot to lock the back door. And two robbers came in, held him at gunpoint, and he got nervous when opening the safe, and he slipped. And when he slipped, it made one of the robbers nervous, and they shot him. And the story is how he kept that positive mindset and how that helped him recover. And in fact, part of it is he's rushed to the ER and he sees in the doctor's eyes that they don't think he's going to make it. And they're asking questions. And finally, one of the doctors asks him, "Are you allergic to anything?" And he says, "Yes." And he hesitates, and they're waiting for him to answer. And he goes, "Bullets." And of course, the doctors laugh, and he says to them, it's like, "I'm still alive. I'm still here. Treat me that way. I'm doing my part. You do yours." And sure enough, the operation was a success. They were able to get him through it. It took him a while to regain all of his mobility, but he did because of his positivity. And that story is very effective, not just because it's a story, but also because yelling that he's allergic to bullets is unexpected. And as it made Chip laugh, he's never heard this story before. It makes you laugh. It has that impact. So you need that conflict to give you the impact. So don't shy away from conflict when you're telling a story.
No, it obviously throwing a little bit of humor in there, even if it's looks like doom and gloom, and all of a sudden the punchline is humor in the face of crisis. It's just so amazing. I mean, basically, what stories do is they connect to your emotion, and as human beings, we are creatures of emotion. We have our egos and so on and so forth, but we have our hearts too, and they're conflicting all the time, and we're going back and forth. So the more that you can connect with people's emotions during your talks, get to the emotional core of your message, the more powerful your message is going to be. And I mean, you talked about your message as far as how you tell your story at the end, and everybody, again, they have their own conflicts, and what there to do is connect to their emotions in one way or another. What the message is that they can do something, whatever they need to do to overcome things that they're looking to overcome. And we are Exhibit A showing you this. It gets them thinking about that. If you have an emotional connection with people, you are memorable. Basically, if I asked you where you were, what you thought of the day of 9/11, you would know exactly where you were when it happened. I mean, I remember I was getting my car repaired, and I was at the auto shop of a friend, and they had a TV room, and they said that the World Trade Center just got hit. If you want to see this on TV. And then I remember going downtown Hartford, because I was treasurer of the Greater Hartford Jazz Society back then. And and I'm walking up and down the empty streets, looking at the skyscrapers, just thinking about that. If I asked you, what did you do the day after 9/11, you probably wouldn't even remember it. I know this is extreme, but this is an emotional connection to how you felt that day. And if you can bring that out of people just by telling your story so that it's memorable, and they connect Eric with his story every time they think about Eric, and me with my story every time they think about me, that's an emotional connection that through one talk is never going to go away, because you made that emotional connection in your talk. And if you can figure that out, and it's based upon what your message is, you tie your message into that, and that, yes, you can overcome this, or yes, you can be positive and if you choose to operate your life with that, you can make really positive things happen for yourself and a whole lot of other people. People remember that just because of the way you prefaced it by connecting emotionally to begin with.
Absolutely. Something else that you need to remember when you're putting your story together is that you need to have a clear structure. You need to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. The story doesn't work if you're just rambling. You need to have that story structure. And the best way to figure out your structure is to tell your story, even if it's just in the mirror or writing it down, over and over. and go, okay, wait, this part doesn't lead anywhere. I can take this out. Edit your story, put it together. And a great way to really understand story structure is to read other people's stories. Read famous authors, short stories, novels. Understand what grabs you. And take a look at, New York Times best-selling authors because they have been able to connect with a large audience. What are they doing? Very often, authors will also have videos available where they talk about storytelling. Storytelling isn't something you're necessarily born with. We all love to tell stories because we all love stories. But the art of telling a good story needs to be learned. So you need to put in the time and the effort to learn how to tell a good story.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, you and your business have the facilities to help people once they have developed that story. I mean, we're talking about giving talks and networking meetings and live and so on and so forth. But with all the tools that we have today, which I know that you use for yourself and for your clients, is the power of telling their story on social media, doing it with their employees, because you talk about management and so on and so forth. Obviously, the book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, is a book about telling stories about yourself and applying that to other people in positive ways. There are so many different approaches that you can have there. But as you mentioned, structuring that in the first place, it's so important to have everything down in writing, which, I'm the spreadsheet nerd. I have all the points down there, and I have a little column, and I'm straightening things out for who I'm talking to. But if that's there, then you can tweak that and you can see how audiences react to this and that. And, if you have close friends or peers that you want to get together in a mastermind situation, it's a great time to run your stories by each other to help each other out. The power of many will really, really help you out that way too. And I know that that's something that you also do professionally with people. So,
Yes, get feedback from your story. Let people tell you what impacted them and focus on those. When you're telling your own story, you may think that point A is the most important, but your audience may be reacting most to point B. If you don't get the feedback, you won't know that. So we are just about at the end of our time. So, Chip, what do you think is the big takeaway for our listeners this week?
well, everybody does have a story. And I mean, whether you're out there talking about it and so on and so forth, that's one thing. But take a look in your lives and look at all the wonderful things that have happened to you, other people who have influenced you, and why. It's a really, really good opportunity for you to start writing down a gratitude journal, starting with yourself. And if you are doing this professionally, as you were mentioning, get yourself organized, write it down, structure it, run it by some people and so on, and really come up with something that's engaging. And that's the most important thing, is just be yourself. Everybody does have a story. And if you can go out there and share yourself that way, you're sharing some wonderful things that you have that nobody else has with people. And that will make a difference. That will make a connection emotionally with people, and they will remember you. And they will start doing that themselves too.
Yes, I think for me, the big message that our listeners should be taking away is the impact of a story. The emotional connection is what separates telling a story from giving a bunch of facts. The story moves people, the story engages emotionally. And yes, you can include those facts in the story, but the story is what connects you. And that's what we're really looking for. Whether it's on a personal level, when you're sympathizing with someone or trying to get them to sympathize with your point of view, the story can do that. Professionally, if you're trying to show your expertise, make a specific point, the story makes that impact so much greater than just facts and figures. And that's what we really want to do, is make an impact. So think about your stories and don't wait until you need to make an impact. When something happens to you, write it down so you remember. Write down the story and keep it. This way, you've got it when you need it and you can make that impact. You've been listening to the Success Showcase. You can catch every episode of the Success Showcase as well as the rest of the Xvadio Podcast Network at xvadio.com, the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Audible, Amazon Music, and wherever you find podcasts. Remember, make this your best week ever and make next week even better. We'll see you then.